Prolog. You live in a palace of gold and alabaster. Servants bow when you breathe. Your bloodline commands armies, controls the grain supply of an entire civilization, and holds the keys to the greatest library ever built. Now imagine being told, at the age of 12, that your husband has already been chosen. It's your brother. Imagine being born into the most powerful family on earth. Not a political metaphor, not a distant cousin dressed up with a fancy title. Your actual brother, the boy you grew up with, the boy who shared your nursery. And if you refuse, you disappear, quietly, permanently. For 300 years, 3 centuries, the Ptolemaic dynasty of Egypt enforced a breeding system on its royal women so grotesque, so clinically obsessive, that it would make even the most deranged medieval monarch flinch. This wasn't love. This wasn't tradition. This was a genetic prison, designed by men, enforced by power, and paid for in the broken bodies and shattered minds of the women who had no say in any of it. This is their story, and it is far worse than you think. Act 1. The Architect of Incest. To understand how this nightmare began, you need to understand one man, Ptolemy II, called Philadelphus. And that title? It literally means the one who loves his sibling. They didn't even try to hide it. When Ptolemy I, one of Alexander the Great's most trusted generals, carved Egypt out of a collapsing empire in 305 BC, he established a dynasty, a Greek dynasty, ruling over an Egyptian kingdom, foreign kings on a pharaoh's throne. And that was the problem. See, the Egyptians had a tradition. Pharaohs were gods. Gods married gods. And in Egyptian mythology, Osiris married his sister Isis. It was sacred, divine. The merging of royal blood was not scandal, it was theology. The Ptolemies looked at that tradition and thought, we can use this. Not because they believed it. These were Greeks, Macedonians. They drank wine from skulls and debated philosophy in bathhouses. Sibling marriage was not part of their culture. In mainland Greece, it was considered an abomination. But in Egypt, it was a tool, a cold, calculated political tool. If you marry your sister, you don't have to share power with another family. No rival dynasty, no ambitious father-in-law, no foreign alliance that could turn into a foreign invasion. You keep everything inside the house. So when Ptolemy II married his full biological sister Arsinoe II around 273 BC, it wasn't romance. It was a corporate merger. And the product being traded? Women. From that moment on, the rule was set in stone. Ptolemaic women existed to breed within the family. Period. Act 2. The rules written in blood. Now let's talk about what these breeding rules actually looked like in practice. Because it wasn't just marry your brother and call it a day. Oh no, it was a system. And like all systems built by powerful men, it had layers. Rule 1. Women marry within the bloodline. Brother-sister pairings were the gold standard, but uncle-niece marriages were acceptable. Cousin marriages were considered practically outbreeding, and if a woman was widowed, she didn't get to grieve. She was recycled, married to the next available male relative, sometimes within weeks. Rule 2. Fertility is duty. A Ptolemaic queen had one job above all others: produce a male heir. If she couldn't, she was sidelined, replaced, sometimes worse. Ptolemaic women who failed to conceive were politically erased, their names scraped from monuments, their images chiseled off temple walls, as if they never existed. Rule 3. Women do not choose. There is not a single recorded instance, in 300 years, of a Ptolemaic princess choosing her own husband. Not one. Every marriage was arranged by the king, the court, or the queen mother, always in service of the bloodline. The bride's opinion was not a category that existed. Rule 4. Resistance is treason. Any woman who defied the system was treated not as a rebel, but as a traitor to divine order. Because remember, these marriages were wrapped in the language of religion. To refuse your brother husband was to refuse the will of the gods. And the punishment for defying the gods in Ptolemaic Egypt? Execution, exile, or something slower and more creative. These weren't suggestions. These were laws of blood, and they produced results that were medically horrifying. Act 3. The family tree that became a wreath. Let's talk genetics, because this is where it gets truly disturbing. You know how a normal family tree branches outward? Parents, grandparents, great-grandparents? The tree spreads, pulls in new blood, new DNA, new genetic material. The Ptolemaic family tree didn't branch, it looped. By the time you reach the later generations, the tree doesn't even look like a tree anymore. It looks like a wreath. The same names appear over and over. Ptolemy marries Cleopatra. Their son Ptolemy marries their daughter Cleopatra. That Ptolemy's son Ptolemy marries his sister, also named Cleopatra. It's not a joke, it's the actual historical record. Let's take the most famous example. Cleopatra VII. The Cleopatra, the one with the asp and the eyeliner in the Hollywood movies. She is often called the last pharaoh of Egypt. She is almost never called what she actually was, the product of at least 6 generations of continuous incest. Her parents were almost certainly siblings. Her grandparents were siblings. Her great-grandparents were siblings. Geneticists who have attempted to reconstruct her coefficient of inbreeding have placed it somewhere between 0.25 and 0.30, which is higher than the offspring of a direct parent-child pairing in a normal population. Let that sink in. And the consequences? They were visible. They were recorded. Later Ptolemaic kings were described by ancient sources as bloated, mentally unstable, physically deformed, prone to fits of rage, and increasingly infertile. Ptolemy VIII was so obese that Roman diplomats openly mocked him. They called him Physcon, fatty. He could barely walk. He murdered his own nephew. He married his brother's wife, then also married her daughter, his own stepdaughter and niece, and had children with both of them at the same time. That's not a dynasty. That's a genetic car crash in slow motion, spanning 3 centuries. And the women at the center of it? They bore the worst of it. They carried the pregnancies. They buried the stillborn children. They watched their sons grow up twisted by the very bloodline they were forced to perpetuate. Act 4. The ones who fought back. Now, here's what most history channels won't tell you. Not every Ptolemaic woman went quietly. Some of them fought. And when a Ptolemaic queen decided she'd had enough, the results were spectacular and bloody. Cleopatra the Third, not the famous one, her ancestor, was married to her uncle, Ptolemy VIII, the same Physcon, the man who had also married her mother. She endured decades of political humiliation, watched her husband's cruelty consume the court, and then, when he finally died in 116 BC, she seized control. She ruled as regent. She played her sons against each other. She picked which one would be king. And when one of them defied her, she had him removed. Cleopatra the Third understood the system better than anyone. She had been its victim, so she became the system. Berenice IV took an even more direct approach. When her father, Ptolemy XII, fled Egypt in 58 BC, chased out by his own people, Berenice didn't wait for him to come back. She declared herself queen. She ruled for 3 years. She married a man of her own choosing, a Seleucid prince, an outsider, someone not from the family bloodline. It was the most radical act a Ptolemaic woman had committed in 2 centuries. Her father came back, of course, with Roman soldiers, and Berenice IV was executed, strangled most likely. Her name was erased from the records, because that was the message. That was always the message. You can fight the system, but the system has armies. Act 5, the cost written on their bodies. We need to talk about what this breeding program did to the women physically. Because the ancient sources, when you read them carefully, paint a picture that is genuinely harrowing. Repeated pregnancies in adolescence. Girls as young as 13 or 14 were expected to begin producing heirs. Their bodies weren't ready. Complications were frequent. Death in childbirth was common. And because the gene pool was so shallow, miscarriages and stillbirths became epidemic in the later dynasty. There are periods in Ptolemaic history where we see queen after queen bearing children who simply don't survive. Infants who die within weeks. Sons born with deformities that the court records delicately refuse to describe. Daughters who vanish from the record entirely, almost certainly dead before their first birthday. And the women who survived? Many of them bore the marks. Ancient descriptions of later Ptolemaic queens mention unusual physical features, jaw deformities consistent with Habsburg-like mandibular prognathism, recurrent illness, and what modern geneticists would recognize as immune system collapse from homozygosity. These women weren't just politically trapped, they were biologically disintegrating. Their bodies were the battlefield, and the enemy was their own DNA, warped by 300 years of deliberate, enforced, inescapable inbreeding. And still, the dynasty demanded more children, more heirs, more Ptolemies married to more Cleopatras, producing more Ptolemies to marry more Cleopatras. A loop with no exit, a circle with no break, until one woman decided to break it herself. Act 6. The Last Prisoner. Cleopatra VII is remembered as a seductress, a political genius, a woman who held Rome's two greatest men in the palm of her hand. But here's what's rarely said. Cleopatra was the final product of the most extreme royal breeding program in human history, and she knew it. When Cleopatra chose Julius Caesar as her ally and lover, and later Mark Antony, she wasn't just making political alliances. She was doing something no Ptolemaic queen had successfully done in nearly 3 centuries. She was choosing men from outside the bloodline. Her children with Caesar and Antony were the first Ptolemaic royals in generations to carry new genetic material. Caesarion, Alexander Helios, Cleopatra Selene, Ptolemy Philadelphus. These children were hybrids, half Ptolemaic, half Roman. And they were, by every indication, healthy. Cleopatra didn't just fight Rome, she fought her own family's 300-year genetic death spiral. And for a brief, shining moment, she won. Then Octavian came, and the dynasty ended, and the breeding program finally stopped, not because anyone chose to end it, but because there was no one left to breed. Act 7. Why this matters. It's easy to look at the Ptolemies and think, well, that was ancient history. We're better now. Are we? The Ptolemaic breeding system wasn't unique. It was just the most extreme. Royal families across history, the Habsburgs, the early Japanese imperial house, dozens of European monarchies, practiced controlled marriages that treated women as vessels for dynastic continuity. The logic was always the same. Power must be kept in the family, and women are the mechanism by which power is transferred. It's the same logic that arranged child marriages across medieval Europe, the same logic behind dowry systems, the same logic that, in some parts of the world, still dictates who a woman can marry and when. The Ptolemies didn't invent patriarchal control over women's bodies. They just perfected it. They turned it into a science. And they ran that experiment for 300 years, across 15 generations, producing a body count of broken women, dead infants, and deformed kings that stands as one of history's most damning indictments of unchecked dynastic power. 300 years, 15 generations, dozens of women, born into gold, married to their brothers, forced to carry children their bodies couldn't sustain, punished when they resisted, erased when they failed. And at the end of it all, a single woman, Cleopatra VII, looked at the wreckage of her bloodline and said, "No more." She chose differently. She reached outside the circle, and even though the dynasty fell, her children survived. Cleopatra Selene went on to rule Mauritania. New blood, a new line, a way out. That's not just history, that's a reckoning. If this video made you think, really think, about how power shapes the lives of women, even in places and times we consider glorious, then hit that subscribe button. Share this with someone who needs to hear it, and drop a comment below. I want to know, which Ptolemaic queen do you think deserves her own video? Because their stories aren't over, not by a long shot. This is Dust and Dynasty, and we don't forget.